Okay, great. Good morning. Thank you, Wendy, and welcome everyone. My name is Gary Lawson. I'll be the first of the three Master Gardeners talking today. As Wendy mentioned, if you could go ahead and mute yourself, and then we will have a general question and answer at the end. If you want, though, you can submit any questions or comments on the chat, and we'll monitor that and make sure that we get some answers to you. When I was speaking with Wendy earlier, asking just some information about your organization, I understand that you as a club have already um, initiated some pollinator gardenings around the county, I'm assuming. So I think it would be fun at the end also to hear and share stories, some of your things that worked and maybe didn't work. We're always certainly learning in the Master Gardener program. So let's go ahead and begin with the next slide, which I think is everyone's favorite activity, and that would be a pop quiz. So which on your screen you have some illustrations of pollinators. Which ones would be considered pollinators? There's a hummingbird, a lady beetle, there's a moth, a bat, a honeybee, and a butterfly. So in your own estimation, which would be considered pollinators? And in fact, they all are pollinators. And if I had more room, I probably would have added humans and flies on there also. But the ones we're going to be focusing primarily today are native pollinators, looking at native bees and butterflies specifically. And then there'll be quite a few at the end that will be considered somewhat unusual pollinators. Next slide we'll have is starting off is a gardening checklist. And a tip would be, before you go out and spend a lot of money, and as you know, you can spend a lot of money on some plants, it's really advised to create an inventory of what currently is either in your garden or in the neighborhood or maybe a demonstration garden that you have an interest in. You can do this inventory preferably over a 1-year period or at least across 4 seasons. And it's very important, as the three of us will talk about, is providing pollinator support across all seasons, even winter. You would think that's when everything is dead. Well, not here on the Central Coast. There are things blooming year round. So it'd be wise for you to, if you have the luxury, to walk around, create an inventory. If nothing else, maybe just some pictures of what is blooming across all 4 seasons. So while you're getting an inventory of the plants, note which ones seem to be frequented or visited by the pollinators. It may not be just bees or butterflies, but a whole host of other types of pollinators. It may be that you not know the name of the plant, but just get an idea. Oh, look, the bumblebees really are attracted to those orange colors of any type of flower there is. You can do this walking around, as I mentioned, in your own garden or in your neighborhood. And pay attention again, what is blooming in succession across all 4 seasons. Fortunately, most of the plants can be transplanted. So I know in one of my courtyards here, I'm always laughing at myself. I'm this adult and I'm always playing in the dirt and I'm moving rocks and I'm moving plants and I'm constantly moving things, because when I had an idea where I wanted to plant it, is not going to be the best place for that plant that I've chosen. So create an inventory, and then you'll have a good basis of beginning your pollinator gardening. So once you've gotten the inventory created, the next tip is going to be adding native plants. And I think you'll hear us today emphasize and underscore the interest in using native plants versus an exotic or an ornamental from outside of the area. By no means are we advocating that you shouldn't plant non-native plants, but let's look at some of the preferences and advantages of using native plants. One is that a native plant is going to attract 4 times as many bees and 3 times or more butterflies or moths than a non-native plant. They have co-evolved, the plants and the pollinators, such they know the cycles, they know when they're blooming and when they're nesting and when they're going to be providing the pollen and the nectar. So you'll find that it's much more efficient to have native plants around, and this would be important during the winter and early spring months also, when there's very little else blooming. Another advantage of using the native plants is they're going to require little, if any, fertilizer. Again, they have co-evolved to live in this climate and the zone. And it's wise when you're doing your inventory to also do an inventory of the soil as to where you're interested in planting. I live east of AG here in the Etna Valley, and I live on a canyon, side of a canyon. So I have heavy clay soil at the bottom and sandy soil at the top, and not a whole lot in the middle. So fertilizer, as we are finding in our well water in most of our area where I live, is that a lot of the agriculture and wineries, the fertilizers leaching into our water table. So an advantage of using the native plants is they require little, if any, fertilizer. And certainly they will be requiring less water. And wow, isn't that important right now as we move into another drought stage here on the West Coast. I don't know, Wendy, maybe your members live everywhere across the US right now, but I'm assuming most people are going to be located here on the West Coast, which is a Mediterranean climate, meaning we're going to have little or no water during the summer, which is fine. That's what they have evolved to live with. Another advantage of the native plants is that they'll become less invasive. Less work for you to be pulling out runners that you didn't want to send to the neighbor's yard. And another important point is creating a patch of about 4 foot by 4 foot or 3 foot by 3 foot of the same plant. The reason is that the insect, the pollinator, if they're jumping from a salvia to a sunflower planted right next to each other, that's a lot of wasted energy and effort trying to figure out what's this next plant about? How do I navigate to get to the nectar and the pollen? So it's just a very labor-intensive process that isn't, in the long run, they're going to be expending more energy than they're going to be taking in. So planting your groupings in a patch, it doesn't have to be exactly a 4 by 4 or 3 by 3. And we'll look at here in a moment that many times that can be met by using a bush or a plant that grows into a mound or a bush. It'll meet that requirement. So once you've created an inventory and you have an idea of the native plants that you want to introduce into your garden or your project, the next would be what I have on the screen here. This is not an eye exam. I realize it's very small print. It's an example of a recommended native plant guide, and I pulled this one from the Xerces book. You will see that in our reading list at the end. I highly recommend that book, and you can download for free a specific native plant recommendation list like is on the screen right here from Xerces. But whether you're using theirs or others, there's plenty out there. Just some things to note. On the left column under the yellow arrow, it'll give you an idea of when that native plant will be blooming and producing pollen and nectar. So is it an early season, mid, late? That's one factor. The other will be trying to get the common name. Now, a word of advice here, a common name we have found, and you may have too, is that a common name can be shared by many different plants that have nothing to do in relation to each other. I was talking to my sister yesterday in Oklahoma, and she was telling me her naked ladies. She was talking about her naked ladies, and I said, send me a picture because I don't think they're the same naked ladies. The ones that we have here, the Amaryllis belladonna, they just are not going to survive in a freezing winter like Oklahoma has. So be careful with common names. Another is going to be the life cycle. Are they an annual or a perennial? Just to help you plan your garden. And then the last would be making note of some special tips, such as does the plant that you want, do they work in clay soil? Do they prefer sand? Are they going to be attracting bumblebees but not butterflies, and you wanted butterflies? So just try and read some of the note recommendations, whatever guide you're using. So another word of caution, or a word of caution, is on the left, you will see a sunflower, and you can see a bee happy collecting pollen and nectar. And on the right is a beautiful example of a sunflower that you might get at Trader Joe's and look great on your table. But if you'll notice, the one on the right is a triple flower type of sunflower. And it's pretty much a pollen and nectar wasteland for the pollinators. They are so over hybridized. They look great to our eyes visually, but the insects are just not going to be able to penetrate down and get to the pollen and the nectar. So be very judicious in your use of double and triple flower petaled flowers in your pollinator garden. So the single wide open flowers are certainly easier access to the pollinators. Similarly, there's other plants that have been hybridized to the point that the pollinators can't get to them. Tea roses, carnations, begonia. Almost a rule of thumb, if you can see the anthers and the pollen, then the pollinators will be able to get to them. But if it's full of tightly clustered petals, save those just for a show plant, not for the pollinators. So the next will be some general pollinator friendly landscaping tips. We've talked about food, providing the across all seasons a source of food, the pollen and the nectar. Once you have the food established, then it'll be important to have a source of water. Water is more of a need for the European honeybees than the native bees, and Karen can give you more information on that. But on the left, we have and this is in our demonstration garden in SLO, is an example of a butterfly puddle station. And if you'll note, there's water, but there's also some pebbles in there. And the reasoning is you want to have an ability for the pollinators to go to the water edge and sip, as well as an advantage here if it's actually mud. The butterflies, that's where they get some of their minerals is mudding in the mud. And on the right, the photo is actually outside my front door at the water fountain, and there's, I think I counted 10 honeybees lined up. So the honeybees do like having a artificial source of water. So we've provided food and water. The next, it will be making sure that you've given them, the pollinators, some shelter. I don't think you can see my mouse, but I'll move it around. This is a shot from our maintaining wildlife habitat in our demonstration garden in SLO. And on the right is a very large specimen of a California buckwheat. I think this might be even the Queen Anne's lace, I'm not sure. It's around 4 feet tall. And so that canopy height is very important for pollinators. The lower ground hugging to the mid to the tall plants, even to the trees. This is a coffee berry, you can see. Yeah, I think it's a coffee berry. So having varied heights in the garden, even if it's in your front yard, is beneficial, giving protection from predators, as well as the weather. to the pollinators. So giving them shelter, even on the ground, and we'll go into this here in just a moment, but so providing a sense of shelter. Some examples, the buckwheat, here's a type of milkweed. I think, Peggy, you can correct me, it's a fascicularis, Asclepias fascicularis. And over here's a salvia, here's a deer grass. And these would meet the 3 or the 4 foot square single source type of flower. So one planting of a milkweed, it would in fact meet that recommendation. In addition to shelter, up in the top right corner, this is a bee box. Karen can go into more detail on that. You can make them yourself, or you can buy them at Costco or online. It's a house made of tubes, because many of the native bees are not social bees. They will be living alone in holes, either in cavities, and Karen can go into more detail. So after providing shelter, there's going to be nesting, providing nesting. An example would be your choice of a flower or a plant could include a plant that has a very pithy core, like I've highlighted here, that you can see the bee has carved a hole, and that's where she will be providing her brood. So it's, if you can, vary your choice of plants to those that have a very pithy stem, so the pollinators can overwinter as well as create their brood stem. This year I am experimenting with a non-native, this Joe Pye weed. It's actually from, I think, the southeast or east coast. I have a wet, dark, heavy soil in my courtyard, and that's what Joe Pye weed loves. So I'm going to give that a try this year to see how it works with the pollinators here. Another source of shelter and nesting would be plant a log or build a brush pile. So it depends on where you live. You can hide these in the back of your beds, in the back of your backyard, so that it isn't seen. But providing some rotten wood will provide nesting and shelter for a number of the pollinators, as well as this open sandbox here, because there are quite a few of ground cavity dwellers. And then using fine compost, so they can also hide and nest in there. So that brings me to the end of my section. So let's, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Karen now will pick up hers and talk about native bees. So Karen, go ahead, and you're muted, Karen.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Now let me share my screen. It's coming. There it is. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name's Karen, and I am going to share with you today about solitary native bees. I became interested in them because I really, really wanted to keep honeybees and get the honey and the whole thing, but my city ordinance disallows that in my area. So I ended up learning a lot about these guys. Are very interesting. So as you can see there on the screen, that they're very important pollinators, and they actually pollinate over 1/3 of our food. Bees pollinate 98% of our vitamin C plants, 70% vitamin A plants, 55% folic acid plants, and 74% of our lipid plants. There are 20,000 species worldwide. 4,000 are in the US, and there are 1,600 in California. Approximately 75% are solitary native bees. There are 98% effective pollinators, whereas honeybees are 5% effective pollinators. For example, it takes 7 mason bees to pollinate one apple tree or 545 honeybees to do the same. When native bees pollinate, they tend to flop on the flowers. So they come in and they're very fast. So they come in, they flop, and they get pollen all over, just like when you eat a powdered sugar donut. And then they groom the pollen either down onto their abdomen, like leafcutter bees, some collected internally, and some like the bumblebee, which are similar to the honeybee, collected on their legs and groom it down into their pollen baskets. Okay, next slide there. Okay, so native bees, they emerge from their nest fully mature and equipped to get busy. They range in size from about a 1/4 inch to the robust 1+ inch of a bumble or carpenter bees. They have 2 sets of wings for a total of 4, and their antenna is used to touch, taste, and smell in 2 different directions. And you can see the rest of the information here. They rarely sting, so they're good to observe with children or yourself, of course. They don't die when they sting, and the males can't sting. And they can mate more than once without dying. So the female solitary native bee builds a nest and cares for her young. So 30% of solitary native bees are cavity nesters, as you can see here in the picture on the bottom left. To preserve the species, she places the female eggs at the back of the nest first, and then the males are in the front. And they emerge first, where they wait around the entrance for the females to mate with multiple times without dying. She lays the egg, places a pollen ball made of a lot of pollen, a little nectar, then plant material or mud if she's a mason bee, then another egg, pollen ball, plant material, and so on. Then she seals the nest with plant material mixed with saliva. She'll lay 30 to 40 eggs in her lifetime. The larvae feed for about 10 days. They pupate inside the cell and emerge full grown. The solitary native bees live approximately 40 days or 6 weeks. As a fun fact here, the leafcutter mandibles of females are usually broad at the tip with 3 to 5 teeth. Who knew bees had teeth? Anyway, and specially designed area for cutting leaf pieces, as you can see in the top left-hand corner, the leafcutter bee cutting out of a rose petal there, rose leaf. You can support your local native bees by providing a nesting site in the morning sun with afternoon shade. The easiest way is to leave an undisturbed area of soil, just like Gary showed you in the wildlife garden in SLO. There's another example there you can see at the top left of your screen. A fun fact is that ground nesting bees, such as digger bees, are equipped with little knee pad-like vestibular plates used to brace against the walls of their tunnels while digging or delivering provisions. You can also note that bumblebees will sometimes use abandoned second-year gopher holes. They build small colonies and produce a small amount of honey for their young. Native bumblebees are the most like the European honeybees in that they produce that small amount of honey, but just enough for their young. So make sure to buy an Airbnb for native bees that can be cleaned. The ones that you buy from Costco are usually glued together, so you can't really clean out the tubes, but you can use them for at least the first year. There's more information source at crownbees.com. You can find a lot of information there, detailed information about building your own, information about what kinds of materials to use in providing a nesting house for your bees. Okay, next one. Native bees can't dance like the honeybees, but they can buzz pollinate. So buzz pollination occurs when the larger bee lands on the flower, grabs onto the flower with her tarsal claws, bites its anthers, and then vibrates her flight muscles to shake the pollen loose all over her body. Then, like the honeybee, she grooms the pollen down her legs into baskets called corbiculae. According to a study published in the Journal of Insect Behavior on April 16, 2018, quote, over time and with practice, bees are able to tune down their vibrations, removing pollen while potentially saving energy. An estimated 8% of the world's plant species require buzz pollination by larger bumble and carpenter bees. Of course, just as Gary mentioned, native bees love native plants. They'll pollinate both ornamental and native plants, but they really do prefer the native plants. They visit 75 to 150 flowers a day. They'll even enjoy nectar and pollen from weeds like thistles and dandelions, so don't worry if you don't get them all out. In a 2003 survey in Berkeley with 1,000 plus different plant types with 50 natives and 950 non-native, almost 80% of the natives attracted bees, whereas about 8% of non-natives did so. You want to be sure to deadhead your flowers, because as they die off, the bees will know that and they will move on. Sometimes when they're only halfway done with the bloom of an annual, they'll note that and they'll move on to a different plant or a different part of your garden. So it's important to keep the deadheading up so you can keep the blooms going. Okay, and then native bees, in case you didn't know, they do not return to their nest to sleep at night. They actually sleep on grasses or inside flower petals. If you're up in the early morning and you happen to have maybe a squash plant or some kind of a flower that closes at night, like the California poppies, sometimes you'll hear some buzzing in there because the bee is in there sleeping. And they're just waiting to get out and get busy in the morning. They do fly and get most of their work done in the morning. So the bees need plants that provide both nectar and pollen. And some plants provide just nectar, some plants provide just pollen, and some plants, like the ones here, provide both nectar and pollen. So they need the pollen as a protein, and then they need the carbohydrate of the nectar for their to fly. The big winner in this picture is the common sunflower. That one actually produces both pollen and nectar like the rest of these. But also another advantage is the seeds for the birds, other pollinators, and the stems are pithy so that you can use those, dry them, and use them in the bee nest. A fun fact is that bees happen to have 2 compound eyes on the sides of their head, with 3 simple eyes on the top of their head. They can see UV light, polarized, and iridescent plants even that humans cannot see. And they actually love hues of blue. You probably noticed that when they're all over your lavender. And just like Gary said, they need a water source with corks or rocks because they can't swim. So they need a way to be able to, if they get in too far, they need to have a way to get out. And lastly, you need to be sure to protect our native bees by trying to keep a pesticide-free zone of your garden, in your garden. You can protect the native bees from bird predators with a wire mesh over the bee nest tubes, and make sure that it actually protrudes a little bit and is not stretched tight across the front, but just protrudes just a little bit. Always be sure to read the labels of anything used in the garden and take necessary precautions to keep yourself and wildlife safe. And I thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat box. Here, these are my resources. I love the Xerxes book too, and I've used it in planting my own garden. My favorite book that I highly recommend is The California Bees and Blooms, A Guide for Gardens and Naturalists. That one gives a lot of detailed information about the bees, the plants, and what the specific type of bee likes, which plant they like. If you want to try to attract specific bees, there's more detailed information in that book. Okay, thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Karen. I'll share my screen. My name is Peggy Burhan, and I'm going to be doing the last section of the presentation. All right. I'm going to talk about Lepidoptera as pollinators. So as many of you may know, Lepidoptera is butterflies and moths. There's over 160,000 species, so we're not going to talk about all of them. And as you might have heard, as well as the bees, there are many butterflies that are experiencing a decline. In fact, there's when you look at butterflies and moths together, about 19% of them in the US are at risk of becoming extinct. So we all hear about the highlight of the monarch butterflies, and I'm going to mention a few things about that. I am also a docent down at the Pismo Grove Butterfly Grove, in addition to being a master gardener here in SLO County. So why are all these insects having problems and declining? Well, we think it's a combination of things. We think it's habitat loss, climate change, diseases, pesticides, we talked about too, invasive plants, overgrazing, roadside mowing. You know, most of our native species, they like, you know, what a lot of people consider weeds, which grow on the roadsides. This native milkweed is just one example here with the monarch butterfly on it. So as we get rid of those roadside plants, we also decrease the habitat for some of our pollinators. So if you want to attract butterflies and moths to your yard, one as pollinators, but two as just because a lot of people like butterflies, they're beautiful. But no, as a disclaimer, Karen's bees are much more efficient at pollinating than any of the butterflies and moths, except for there are some specific butterflies or moths that have a relationship with a certain plant. So bees are definitely going to be your heavy duty workers in terms of pollination. But if you're going to want to attract butterflies to your yard, you want to consider the whole life cycle. Where do they lay their eggs? Where do they want to go as a caterpillar? Do they have habitat to create a chrysalis? And then they emerge as this beautiful butterfly. So thinking about all those things as we talk today in today's program. So when you think about caterpillars, they need something to eat, right? They're actually going to chew on a plant. And when you think about the winged adult, whether it's a butterfly or moth, they're going to need nectar, just as we're talking about with the bees, something to sip and drink the nectar, and in the process they pollinate. So this is a quote from the Xerces Society, and they say that growing the right flowers, shrubs, and trees with overlapping bloom times is the single most effective course of action to support pollinators from spring through fall, and as Gary mentioned, even into the winter in our climate. So Xerces is a national organization, but in terms of California, we have things growing and we have pollinators around all year long. So we have to think about that life cycle. So how do the Lepidoptera pollinate? Well, much in the same way as bees, they're going to nectar, right? They land on a flower. They don't really care too much about the pollen, but they pick up the pollen. They go then to another flower of that type and they drop the pollen there. So that is, you know, obviously very simplistic of what happens there, but there's also some special butterflies and moths that pollinate only certain flowers. They have very long proboscis that might go into only a tubular flower, etc. So there are certain things that where there's very species specific. And then in terms of getting butterflies to your yard, there are certain things that they do like. They like a different height of plant material. So even though we do want to consider a patch, as Gary talked about, you might want to have like hiding places it creates when there's different heights of flowers. You want a diversity of plants so that you get different types of butterflies, and they like lots of sun. They usually only fly if it's about 55 degrees or more, and they can heat themselves up by sunning. So they do prefer plants that are in the sun. And they like protection from wind. So if you want them to kind of hang out in your yard, in some area where there's some trees or some tall bushes to provide some protection. And as we mentioned with the bees, they will want water for puddling as well. You will see them down in a mud puddle or on a bird bath, taking little bits of water. They do take water from dew as well in the morning. So even if you don't have a water feature, you may find that they have access to water in that manner. So what can you do for butterflies? Well, you can plant nectar everywhere, right? We can use nectar at all times of the year. We feed those hungry butterflies. They get energy from that sugary nectar. And especially for us, there's not a lot in bloom when you think about most cultivars in the late fall and the early and through winter and the early spring. But as Gary said, take an inventory, take a look around your yard to see what's in bloom around your neighborhood, what's in bloom in those times of the year, and that will really help your butterflies and moss in your area. You can get a list. Here's the link. You can get a list from the Xerces Society specifically for monarchs if you're interested in that. Butterflies. A lot of other butterflies and insects will like these plants as well. But it's similar to that chart that Gary showed you with the early, late, and mid-year flowering habitat. So as we said, cultivars are not bad. We love them all, and we should have a mix in our gardens. I have lantana in my yard, and it's in bloom all year long, at least some blooms, and there's always pollinators on the lantana. It does attract a lot of butterflies, but there are many other plants that are heavy butterfly attractors like bee balm and coneflower, black-eyed Susans, and pretty much everything in the sunflower family. And as Gary mentioned, though, trying to not get those super double flowers that then don't allow the pollination. So thinking about that, but then also thinking about native plants. If you look at native plants, here are some of my favorites: manzanitas, some daisy-like flowers like fleabane. Yarrow is very attractive to butterflies. Hummingbird sage and native thistles as well. I think my all-time favorite really has to be the ceanothus, probably followed by the buckwheat, to attract pollinators and bees and butterflies specifically. And milkweed flowers will attract some pollinators. I have some pictures of that coming forward. Coyote brush has a lot of blooms on it certain times of the year. A lot of people think of it as a weed. Maybe it's something that you keep off on the side if it's not attractive enough for your garden. And then mule fat too, which flowers heavily in the springtime. So thinking about, maybe making a combination of natives and non-natives in your garden can be helpful. And again, to reiterate, not using insecticides, because insecticides do kill butterflies and caterpillars as well. Even using some things such as insecticidal soap may damage them. So usually if I have a lot of aphids, I'm spraying them off with water or just brushing them off with my fingers to try not to use insecticides. We do have Master Gardener classes on this program called IPM, or Integrated Pest Management. You can access that online too. And we have a helpline. So if you have questions about trying to get rid of pests or in managing certain plants, the Master Gardener helpline helps home gardeners answer gardening questions. So feel free to give us a call. We have one in SLO and in North County, and as well as in Arroyo Grande. So caterpillars need food plants. And what that means is it's a plant that the caterpillar is going to eat. And the butterfly typically lays her eggs either on that plant or nearby. And so the unfortunate thing for some people is that they are going to actually eat your plant. I remember the first time I planted milkweed, before I got into all this and knew a lot about it, I came out one day and the caterpillars had eaten my whole plant. And I was like pretty upset about it. But then you learn, oh, look, those are monarch caterpillars that are on my plant, and they're kind of fun to watch as they grow into different stages. So it's not just about monarchs. There are a lot of other butterflies that have food plants. And if you're interested in attracting a specific butterfly, you might look at what are the plants that attract them. So some of them are non-natives. Like I am trying to grow passion vine in my yard to attract the Gulf fritillary butterfly. And I'm going to share with you one of my favorite books. Hopefully, if you see me on the screen, you can see this book. It's called An Introduction to Southern California Butterflies. I realize we're not in Southern California, but it's one of the best books that I've been able to find. A lot of these butterflies are in our area as well. So you'll find that they they typically, you'll cover the same. So I'm just going to open it up randomly to a page, and I've got the GABS checker spot, and it says the food plant is things in the sunflower family, such as woolly asters and telegraph weed. Oh, so that's great to know if you want to attract that butterfly, what would be the food plant for it. So it also will tell you different types of plants. There's my Gulf fritillary that likes the passion, the passiflora vine, and it will tell you different types of year that they're around. And if there's a specific nectar plant that they like, it lists that as well. So sorry.
Peggy, question here that was presented. What can you do when the monarchs have eaten all the milkweed so the caterpillars survive, other than freaking out, as you said?
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about milkweed, but I'll just answer that quickly now. That in my experience, when they've eaten all the milkweed, it may be non-native milkweed, and we can ask that person if they know for sure. I have native milkweed in my yard, and sometimes there are 6 caterpillars on a plant, and they eat less when they eat native milkweed. And I don't know why that is. We're going to talk about the non-native milkweed. In my opinion, the non-native milkweed is like Snicker bars. You know, when it's Halloween and your kids come and they have a whole bag of candy and they eat it all. It's not very good for them, but they'll eat it all, right? So it's the same kind of thing with the milkweed. The non-native milkweed is not very good for the monarch caterpillars, but they will eat it all. And then you're right, you have caterpillars that don't have anything to eat. There is some, if the caterpillar is very large, they will eat some melons, which is kind of a fun fact that a lot of people don't know. So if you had, but they have to be very large caterpillars. They can't be the little ones because they still need the milkweed. So you may be able to keep them going with some melons. So I'm going to move on to, and so caterpillar foods can be natives and non-native. So you see a list here of quite a variety of different native and non-native caterpillar foods. So a lot of people ask me, because of my experience with the butterflies, is what to do to help save the monarch. So you can plant milkweed and you can plant nectar flowers. And we talked a lot about the nectar flowers. The monarchs come here, as many of you know, to the coast of California in the winter. They're coming here in October through February, and there's not a lot of bloom in those times. So the number one thing you can do is plant nectar that is available during those times. And if you want to plant milkweed, the Xerces Society does not recommend planting it close to the wintering sites, the overwintering sites. So that would be at least 5 miles within those. So let's say if you live in Pismo Beach or you live in Los Osos, it'd be better to plant milkweed if you're at least 5 miles away from the coast. And the reason is that it may make the butterflies break their diapause or break their overwintering. And then they could lay eggs and then they won't survive. So they may waste a lot of their energy when they see milkweed nearby. Oh, I don't have to overwinter, there's milkweed here. And milkweed doesn't naturally occur within 5 miles of the coast. So when we're going to look at a couple different types of milkweed. We're going to look at some native milkweed, and which I have pictures of on the coming slides. The two that emerge earlier, which might be better on the central coast, are the woolly pod or the Areocarpa or the Californica. The tropical we want to avoid because it carries a parasite called Ophryrocystis electroscleria, or OE. And so we're trying to encourage people to replace it with native milkweed or to cut it back completely down to the ground. It is a perennial in October, November timeframe, and throw out those clippings because they harbor the parasite on them. So if you can't pull it out and replace it with native, that's what they recommend. So no native. So here are some of the examples. As Gary mentioned, in our demo garden, we have this narrow leaf milkweed, Asclepias fascicularis. A lot of it, it's probably the easiest one to grow, in my opinion. It does grow by runners sometimes, or spread by runners as well as by seed. And then the showy milkweed, the Asclepias speciosa, is another favorite in this area. It has a much wider leaf and a pink flower on it. Butterflies love that. And the woolly pod milkweed and the California milkweed are two that are more of a gray-green color and kind of fuzzy. And they are the ones that emerge earlier. They're a little harder to find. I've been trying to grow them from seed. You can get seeds online. And we're trying to propagate them in our our demonstration garden. And when we can have plant sales again, once the pandemic is lifted a little bit, then you'll probably be able to purchase them from us as well. Here's an example of the non-native. The thing that people like about it, it does have pretty flowers, and it is sold a lot in the big box stores. It grows easily, and so people have been using it a lot. We think that this might be one of the reasons that the monarchs are in decline, is because if they get this parasite, they might emerge from their chrysalis deformed, or they might emerge deformed that you can't tell, like they're damaged, they fly off, and then they die. So it's really important to try to get this non-native milkweed, out of our system. It'll take a lot of education to do that. So I want to stop with the butterflies and just go on to some other non-bee pollinators and non-butterfly pollinators that are found here in San Luis Obispo County. We have a fourth member of our pollinator team, Norm Smith, who couldn't be here today. He's an entomologist, and I am not an entomologist, but I'm going to show you his slides and give you some examples of some other things that are in your garden that you might not think of as pollinators. So here is the green lacewing, and you might have heard of them because, of course, they like to eat aphids, but they also will nectar on flowers. So they're great to have around for a lot of reasons. So you want to look out for those guys and definitely preserve them. These are the syrphid flies. There's two examples of syrphid flies here, and the picture of the larva, that is the larva of the syrphid fly. As you can tell, they look like bees or wasps, right? So you might, but they have only 2 wings instead of 4 like the bees. And their larva is eating aphids. You can probably see the aphids there in my picture. This is milkweed in the demonstration garden, and it has these aphids that are yellow aphids on there, and these larvae will eat them. They'll also eat mealybugs too. So if you see these guys on your plants, it's a good thing. And then here's the parasitic technid fly. You often see that on flowers as well. And look at all those bristly hairs that it has. That's a great way to capture some pollen and pass it on to the next flower. This is called a thread-waisted wasp. And look at how thin the waist is, hence the name, right? It does eat caterpillars and grasshoppers. So, we do like some of our caterpillars, but unfortunately, it will predate on those as well. But it also will pollinate flowers because it needs nectar as an energy source too. And so you'll see them around on your plants as well. Usually when wasps are gathering other insects, they're bringing them to their nests for their young, and they're using the energy for themselves by pollinating, by sipping nectar on flowers. This is an example of a mud dauber wasp. You might have seen these nests before in your yard. They prey on caterpillars and spiders. Again, they also, though, go to flowers and get nectar as well. And here is the crabronid wasp. It also predates on some caterpillars, but again, going to flowers for nectar. And look again how much it looks like a bee. I don't think that's a mistake. Nature likes to mimic things that are successful. So here's another small wasp that predates aphids. So these are good guys to have along. They eat aphids and thrips and then also pollinate while they're doing it. So this one, he's only 3 millimeters long. So he's very, very small. I have an example later of one that I found on in my garden. And tarantula hawks, a lot of you have seen these. They're beautiful. Look at the color, the bright orange wings and the black. Again, a warning, their sting is very powerful. So their coloration is a warning, like stay away from me. But he is also pollinating. This is a milkweed flower that this wasp is on right now, or this tarantula hawk is on right now. Spider wasps. Now, these are Norm's slides, so only an entomologist would tell you that this is a handsome wasp, but he also has a powerful sting. And look at that warning coloration, right? The orange and the black saying, hey, stay away from me. But this wasp is about 1/2 inch long. So it would only take a spider that was small like that. So here he is attacking a spider. And then this is a male scoliid wasp, and they're not as hairy, but they also still pollinate. You see them on the flower there. Of course, everyone's favorite, the yellow jacket. While you're trying to have a picnic, he's trying to get some of your protein to take back to his nest. But yellow jackets, again, will also nectar in, and since they're nectaring, they're also pollinating. And you see all the little hairy hairs on this yellow jacket that they can attract the pollen and take it to the next plant. And then this is the California paper wasp, which you might have seen around as well. And again, look at that black and yellow coloring, very common. This is another very small predatory wasp. It likes to hang out on buckwheat. This picture, Norm got this from the elfin forest in Los Osos, so very near to where you are. And not only does this wasp prey on the thrips that it finds on the buckwheat, but it also takes the nectar. So it gets like everything it needs from buckwheat. So when you see some buckwheat around, maybe take a close look and see if you see any of these guys on there. This is from my garden on my satsuma tree, and you can see a jumping spider that's actually eating a melachillid bee. So one of our native bees, but it's being attacked by one of our other native species. So it kind of like the whole cycle of life, right? Right there, happening all the time. So just briefly, we're going to talk about a few flowers that we find that are very helpful for attracting pollinators. Different buckwheat species, just as I just mentioned with that last wasp. There are many buckwheat species. These are just a few that you can put in your garden. There's a lot of species. According to CalScape, there's 172 species of ceanothus that will grow in California. Most are very drought tolerant, and they are just bee magnets. Mine are just covered with big bumblebees. So this is an example of one of the very large ones. But they come also in very small mounding types as well. Of course, herbs. These are non-natives, but my herbs, these are all from my garden, the mint, the thyme, and the rosemary, covered with a lot of bees and other pollinators. So, and also great in the kitchen. So you can get a double use there. Yarrow, again, here's a couple examples, different kinds of yarrow that you can put in your garden. Toyon, Christmas berry, when it's in bloom, lots of pollinators. This is a very large tree that grows, or shrub. This is an interesting plant that Norm has in his garden. And this has a very, very minuscule flower that you wouldn't imagine. And it attracts a ton of pollinators. So even though the flower isn't very showy, it does attract a lot of pollinators, as well as this yellow Perla Verde tree. And then I'm going to just put this up as a summary of kind of the main things we talked about in terms of looking at your flower types, your overlapping bloom types, including some native plants, looking at making sure you have enough single flowers, that you have trees as well, and deadheading, leaving bare ground for those nesting bees, and growing flowers in patches, and of course always avoiding insecticides and herbicides and fungicides as much as possible. And here's some additional resources. So I want to close so that we have time for some questions as well. Thank you, everyone.
Peggy, there is a question about growing fascicularis in Los Osos, but cutting back in October. Is that allowed?
Well, the thing about having the milkweed too close to the overwintering sites is really the issue, regardless of what type it is. So even the non-native, they don't recommend that you plant too close to the overwintering sites. But if you're going to plant milkweed, and you know there are going to be people that won't get that message, and there's probably a lot of milkweed within 5 miles of the overwintering site, it would be preferable to plant the native milkweed, yes.
Okay. And Karen, there was a question about what's the cause of bee colony collapse? Would you want to take that one?
I'll take it. I looked up on USDA.gov about colony collapse, and they state that there's no scientific cause has been proven, but it is also not the only threat. So the threats that the honeybees as well as the native bees have are pests, pathogens, poor nutrition, which is why the native plants and also why you don't want over hybridized, just like Gary mentioned. And also a substantial exposure to pesticides. If you want to research it yourself and ask more questions like detailed questions, a really good site that I like to use is the Bee Garden, beegarden.ucdavis.edu. You may already know, but they have a Haagen-Dazs honeybee haven. They have their own bee garden and they have honeybees and they produce honey for them, as well as they also study the solitary native bees. They have a lot of different presentations you can watch online, as well as you can contact them and ask